Progressive rock music has its roots in the mid-1960s psychedelic cultural phenomena. During that time, the British invasion and folk rock bands began to expand the sonic possibilities of their music. These groups slowly started to abandon the concise verse-chorus-verse patterns of rock and roll and moved towards fluid, free-form-oriented song structures. Just as important was the incorporation of elements from Indian and Eastern music. Along them, the principles of free-form jazz were included to the psychedelic sound, emphasizing spontaneous emotions over calculated and estimated compositional constructions. Experimenting with new studio technology, electronically altering instruments and voices, was a part of this altered approach as well. Acid rock groups like the Jimi Hendrix Experience and Cream stand as descriptive and popular examples of the path from psychedelic sunshine pop towards a more aggressive and distinct rock expression, in particular showcased in their improvised live performances. The boundary dividing the experimental and progressive classification is a thin and at times contested one for this era. The pioneering psychedelic progressive rock bands to be found at www.progarchives.com will in most cases be found in the Proto-Prog section of the site. Amongst these pioneering outfits are acts like the Beatles, Jefferson Airplane, and Vanilla Fudge. Artists such as Pink Floyd will not be found there, though, as their career extended well beyond these first, formative years. Psychedelic progressive rock music may contain the elements previously described in varying combinations, but the artistic perspective of progressive rock is another factor. Some psychedelic rock bands stuck to the mid-1960s beat rock style in purest form, not partaking in the experimental development of the impressionistic possibilities of psychedelic rock music others spearheaded. The evolution of the psychedelic depth within a progressive context could be seen, for instance, in the 1960s recordings of Arcadium and Baby Grandmothers. One good example of early 70s continental European progressive psychedelic rock is the album by Ahura Mazda, and from Britain Jade Warrior's early efforts fuse psychedelic rock and ethnic music. Current artists exploring the vintage 60s/70s style and sound are acts like the Spacious Minds and Acid Mother's Temple. The entire Western pop culture scene was influenced by the psychedelic culture to some extent, including other prog genres such as prog folk. In Germany, artists influenced by the British psychedelic movement formed their own genre called krautrock. The pioneering early 70s bands in this genre represent the progressive acid rock sound of Germany, experimenting with long instrumental improvisations, emphasizing the use of psychedelic effects and weird electronic sounds. Some examples are artists like Amon Diel, Ashra Temple, Can, Giawit Diary Sisse, Necronomicon, and Yatha Sidra. The progressive electronic style emerged from krautrock. Some of the most influential artists of this genre, such as Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze, explored a distinct psychedelic musical style at first, which was influential for the development of the space rock sound. The late 1960s psychedelic rock scene also spawned the birth of the space rock genre. The pioneering acts of this genre assimilated krautrock elements like repetitive hypnotic beats and electronic/ambient soundscapes as they moved away from the common musical and compositional approach. The synthesizer, with its bubbling tones and spacey patterns, provoking a gliding flow, is a typical instrument of this genre. Guitars are by preference played with glissando technique, and delay/echo effects are heavily used, and elements originating from reggae/dub are fairly common. Several bands combine their live performances with trippy light shows using random fractals. Albums in this genre will often include at least one long meandering jam based on a main theme, where loops and wave-like fluctuations provide slight variations to this structural foundation. Stories, images, Song titles and album names referring to cosmic themes are fairly common features of the genre. Hawkwind's live album, Space Ritual, is said to be the ultimate space rock album due to the collaboration with sci-fi author Michael Moorcock. His lyrics are performed by a narrator and underlaid with synth elements. Pink Floyd can be regarded as pioneers of spacey music during the band's early phase, as exemplified by certain tracks from The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, or the stirring live performance of Careful with That Axe Eugene from Ummagumma. Grobschnitt provides another fine example of classic space rock with their epic effort, Solar Music. Other bands explored the space rock sound for a limited time period only. Gong released groundbreaking albums in the genre at the start of their career, while British hard rock band UFO released the extraordinary album Flying, 1 Hour Space Rock, as their sole contribution to the genre in 1971. A space rock scene can be found in most countries' sporting artists producing music with a Western-oriented or influenced sound. Swedish bands are known for a brisk exchange of musicians among each other. The Strange Days festivals from 1997 to 2000 showcased the American space rock scene. Japan is an inexhaustible reservoir of artists exploring both psychedelic progressive rock and progressive space rock. Representative examples of the style are bands such as Sun Space Collective with their focus on long grooving improvisations, Quark Space and Ozric Tentacles with their stronger emphasis on electronic elements, and Vespero and Hydria Spacefolk with their inclusion of ethnic-originating musical components. Other groups like Escapade and the legendary Pink Dots represent an avant-garde approach to the genre, whereas Subarachnoid Space and Kinski are examples of artists that provide transitions to the post-rock genre. The 1960s and 70s were a time of liberation, a time of rebellion against rigid rules and strict moral boundaries. In those freedom of expression days, an artist would typically herald their liberal attitudes as a mind-expanding trip on stage together with the audience in two ways. One was to realize audio/visually the visual and auditory hallucination as it was, and another was to play their repertoire spiritually and improvisationally under the trip. As for the latter approach, they devoted themselves solely to slow to mid-tempo, playing with low-tuned guitars in a heavy and expansive manner for playing steadily under this twilight condition. In the same time period, this approach to the musical trip was also taken on by some artists, especially in the hard rock and heavy metal scene. This new style, drenched in heavy and downer psychedelia, was called stoner rock. The name originates from the expression stoned, referring to people in altered states of mind while under the influence of psychedelic substances. The stoner rock genre was universalized as a strict musical style only by the industrial grunge rock genre that gained worldwide popularity in the early 1990s. The common denominator of all the artists mentioned is the representation of their personal cultural and political backgrounds, whilst playing slow-paced depressive songs with heavy guitars and echoic rumbling drums as the dominating features. Most of current outfits claiming to be the so-called psychedelic heavy progressive rock ones should be much influenced by the traditional stoner or grunge rock, as well as the early psychedelic progressive rock. They can be considered as a borderline case between psychedelic progressive, heavy progressive, and progressive metal. Acid folk can be mentioned as another musical style with hallucinogenic approach. Psych folk or psychedelic folk are other names for this genre, and is vaguely defined as a rock subgenre due to the mixture of folk rock and psychedelic rock. This is a style lacking in strict definitions, and it is contested whether or not the term was actually used at what is deemed the dawn of the genre. It's an undeniable fact that the acid folk scene gained some popularity by the efforts of artists in the folk revivalism, But it's important to remember that there were two distinctly different approaches taken by those who helped shape the genre in the mid-1960s. Some folk singers approached a psychedelic rock structure as was popular at that time, while some psychedelic rock outfits tried to absorb and incorporate techniques and elements from folk rock. Both have great importance in the development of acid folk, and this may be the reason that strict definitions of the genre cannot be given. In view of the history, it's no exaggeration to claim that Tyrannosaurus Rex, Syd Barrett, or the incredible string band in UK rock scene seasoned the traditional acid folk with a more progressive spice. They, as eccentric or heretical rock outfits, accepted and incorporated Middle Eastern and Oriental elements or instruments, and the result was the foundation for the current progressive acid folk movement. And in the eastern parts of the world, different acid streams was provided by artists such as Taj Mahal Travelers or Magical Power Mako, who exerted a great influence on younger progressive bands. Their amazing achievements resides in the twilight zone between the prog folk and psychedelic prog subgenres, a path that never ends. In addition of the styles described, psychedelic elements can be found in many other genres of progressive rock. The psychedelic cultural explosion had an immense influence on the Western popular culture, and traces of it can still be heard also outside of progressive rock circles. The collective techno-rave parties carry on the legacy of the audiovisual attack from the Pink Floyd concerts in 1968, to cite one example. As the psychedelic movement was a large cultural phenomenon, it is difficult, and maybe unnecessary, to fence it to a clear category. Psychedelic progressive rock has been developing towards several different directions over time, and the task of classifying them as distinct genres and subgenres is an ever-ongoing process, often loaded with strong opinions. The psychedelic rock artists which are not considered as progressive in style are not listed in the database of www.progarchives.com. This in order to maintain the site scope to be a progressive rock reference. The aim of this description is to be a tool of reference for potential and existing fans of the genre, and we hope that this will aid those who read it to a better understanding of the genre as well as to enjoy and discuss the subject at hand both in the forums of the Prog Archives website as well as in other places online and offline both.
What sort of relationships exist among Adorno's condemnation of popular/popularist music, his notion of musical progress, and the notion of progress attached to progressive rock? Clearly, from Adorno's point of view, the mere facts of increased technical complexity, of harmony, of form, of rhythm, of meter, and of increased virtuosity in progressive rock music, especially as they reference classical music, would not be de facto indicators of progress. Indeed, one could certainly argue that the very elements in Stravinsky's music that Adorno is railing against, namely the use of pre-approved musical material, tonal or quasi-tonal harmonies, borrowings from contemporary music, such as jazz, and parodies of Baroque and classical forms, that gives his music a phony imprimatur of quality and authenticity, are also evident in progressive rock. This is certainly the case where bands are using the traditional instruments of Baroque and classical music, such as the harpsichord and Spanish guitar, or are giving their works historical titles like Toccata or Suite, drawing from the lexicon of 17th and 18th century music. Again, the imprimatur of quality, the weight of tradition, of substance. In this sense, for Adorno, progressive rock would be patently regressive. A different point of view is offered by progressive rock historian and aficionado Jerry Lucky, who claims that we make a mistake when we look for newness or originality as such in the music of progressive rock bands. Rather, what is progressive about progressive rock is not necessarily its musical, technical, and technological aspects, although these are partly what differentiate progressive rock aesthetically from other, more traditional forms of rock and pop, but its philosophical approach, a philosophy that embraces a nobler goal, the goal of any art form, to be able to express a greater range of emotions and ideas, with greater shades and nuances. Lucky suggests, too, that one way to define progressive rock is with reference to its cerebralness, against the more visceral qualities of mainstream rock. While Adorno would certainly disagree, since he argues that intellectualism, the mind over the heart, is the charge commonly applied against progressive modern art music by ignorant listeners and critics, there is nonetheless some common ground to be found here. In seeking to define or delineate musical progress, both Lucky, for Prog, and Adorno, for modern music, highlight the importance of the progressive musician's resistance to the demands and vicissitudes of the commercial music market and to tradition and convention. For Lucky, citing John Anderson of the band Yes, progressive rock is about making music without having to worry about time, without the restrictions of conventional song formats and lengths. By extension, progressive rock, by resisting these conventions, takes the risk of being unpopular and commercially unsuccessful, albeit a limited and calculated one, as prog groups do seek a broad audience and are often successful by industry standards. John Anderson claims, for example, that Yes has sold 35 million albums. By creatively resisting the demands of the industry without entirely rejecting them, Anderson has stressed the importance of making great music that lasts forever, creating music that has a heart and soul, while resisting what he describes as the business money pop model, the corporate idea, the record company idea to make an album because we needed a hit. They complicate the popular music soundscape and the notion of popularity, and in so doing create music that is, in the words of the members of the prog rock band Gentle Giant, unique, adventurous, and fascinating. Adorno offers a similar argument, namely that progressive or radical music, which is unique by its very nature, eschews the commercial market and mere sensuality, following the integral laws of musical structure to their logical consequences, instead of striving for the more accessible middle road via the proper mixture of enticement and banality. Modern music, which Adorno presents as an example of art that seeks complete autonomy from the demands of capitalist culture, could strive for such purity only by abandoning any measure of popularity. Ironically, the composers Adorno most valued, Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg, actively sought the publication and performance of their works and hoped for the eventual acceptance and understanding of their aesthetic, and indeed, over time, much of this music has become canonical and, as such, increasingly commercially viable. In contrast, Lucky denounces the idea that artists must progress and create new music as one example of the centrality of the concept of progress in the 20th century. He contrasts this need for innovation with the minimal qualitative adjustments to composition, skill level, arrangements, etc., throughout Mozart's life. This taste for novelty is also difficult to pinpoint and tends to turn us away from the work of mainstream progressive rock musicians. At the end of a series of dubious arguments, one of which relegates classical music to a genre, alongside subgenres of pop, Lucky distinguishes music that is progressive musically, challenging music, from progressive rock music as created within certain perimeters, longer, structured songs, with many movements and parts, related or not, featuring intricate musicianship, using contrasting elements like loudness, dynamics, and mood, incorporating long solos or improvisations, including other musical styles and referring to orchestras either by incorporating them or by using mellotrons and synthesizers. Although Lucky's criteria seem generally sound, here we will define progressive rock not as a genre, to which we will refer as prog rock, but instead through the intention that underlies all these musical characteristics, to bring substance and meaning in popular music, so that it lives up to the value popular music has for those who listen to it and play it.
What is an art rock album? It is a byproduct of an emergent hippie aesthetic from the 1960s, which focused on the use of studio technology, excellent musicianship, and other creative means to make sophisticated and lyrically important music. Songs were carefully chosen and sequenced with the intention that consumers would listen to the album intelligently, and songs would unfold in order as do pages and chapters in a book. Some have referred to these as concept albums, collections of discrete but thematically unified songs whose whole is greater than the sum of its parts, although many have debated about whether a concept album is defined strictly by its cohesive lyrical and storytelling content, by recurring musical themes, or both. The definition of a rock art album has less to do with what it contains and more to do with how it challenged the norm in popular recorded music. What society considers artistic is generally subjective and socially constructed, so an understanding of industry norms is necessary to understand how art rock albums were distinct. Because record companies were focused on profit, they placed a premium on conventionally popular music that appealed to mass audiences. Record executives and the public alike often viewed these records as disposable. Songs on albums tended toward the short, conventional, and atomistic. This is not to say that producers and performers had no interest in artistic music, or that the rock album was the first attempt in modern history to marry popular music with art. Indeed, scholars have documented band leader Mitch Miller's careful efforts at crafting the perfect vocal sound for Johnny Mathis, and his ongoing efforts to produce unique sounds in his records. Before the mid-1960s, a diverse set of artists, from Frank Sinatra to Woody Guthrie to Johnny Cash, recorded thematically consistent works that could be termed concept albums. However, these were not the norm when industry leaders considered the commercial viability of the album. When Columbia reintroduced the improved LP in 1948 after failed attempts to commercialize it in the 1920s and 1930s, industry leaders did not have a strong conception of its potential. Columbia's first two offerings were Mendelssohn's Concerto in E minor for violin and orchestra and the voice of Frank Sinatra, and a diversity of album offerings followed, including original cast recordings of Broadway musicals, film soundtracks, and comedy albums. Profits drive industry. If a song happened to be considered artistic, this was a happy byproduct of selling a successful record. Music and artists alike were commodified. The evolution of jazz music from popular dance hall music to artistic music for listening robbed it of some of its mass commercial appeal, creating space for rhythm and blues and rock and roll to take its place as popular dance music for young people in the 1950s. Record executives did not see rock and roll as an artistic form in the same sense that classical was or that jazz became, and thus they did not sell it that way. Until 1965, it was largely considered a passing fad and a vehicle to sell a new kind of music to a narrow demographic, teenagers. Given the industrial delivery standard of the early 20th century, that most recorded music was delivered on a 78 RPM record which could hold roughly 3 minutes of music. Whatever art was contained in a pop record had to be contained within a single short song. This norm did not change as the 45 RPM record replaced the 78 RPM as the top-selling format for listening to recorded music. The 33 1/3 RPM long-playing LP album could contain longer recordings, which meant that entire symphonies and long jazz works could be more efficiently packaged. In pop and rock, however, the album became a means to sell collections of individual songs, usually by a single artist. These developments in broader historical context, tracing the evolution of popular music as art to 19th century cabarets in Paris. These revolutionary moments when culture clashed with art transformed the popular landscape. Standardization of the 45 RPM and 33 1/3 RPM across the industry in the 1950s meant that, for the first time, record companies had to figure out how to effectively market two products that were at one time competitive with one another. By the mid-1960s, record companies had decided that singles and albums should be duplicated and diluted. Singles could be sold on the strength of A-sides, even if the B-side was of poor quality, and albums could be sold on the strength of the same, duplicated, single, with filler material making up the remainder of the album. In 1956, no number one hit singles appeared on a contemporary album. By 1964, 87% of number one hits were on albums. This strategy assumed that consumers would be willing to purchase units based on the strength of one hit, even if the remainder of the unit contained weaker material.
A string orchestra, chamber choir, harp, piano, harpsichord, organ, synthesizers, mellotron, timpani, and a glockenspiel. Multi-sectional songs, some over 8 minutes. A guest appearance by Rick Wakeman of Yes. A keyboardist on tour. This description sounds like a progressive rock band, but if you add that to heavy metal, you get Black Sabbath as they progressed musically in 1973 to 1975. They used instruments such as flute, bongos, claves, congas, a shaker, a tam-tam, and a vibraslap. Regarding their use of different instruments, Tony said, "I did things like that to get a different sound into our music." On the production side, they used tape speed manipulation and tape reversal for additional interesting sounds. Regarding the experimental aesthetic, Tony Iommi viewed their next album Sabbath Bloody Sabbath as a continuation from Volume 4. He said, "Compared to the previous records, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath has more class about it, more arrangements, and it's more adventurous. It was a leap forward." Thus, if he thought Master of Reality to Volume 4 was a complete change, having jumped an album, and from Volume 4 to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was a leap forward, then the band had come quite far from Master of Reality to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Ozzy Osbourne had the same perspective, saying that Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was stage 2 of a new trip that began with Volume 4. Tony said in 1973, "We played a much more jazz-influenced music before we hit our present formula." What inspired them to continue the experimental qualities of Volume 4 and take them to another level? In the time between the recording of Volume 4 and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath there was the performance with the legendary progressive prog rock trio Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and 14 performances with Badger, a prog band that included Tony Kaye, the keyboardist that had been in Yes before Rick. But more significantly perhaps were the 14 dates with Gentle Giant, one of the more quirky and experimental prog bands of the time. It is likely that the nearly 30 performances alongside prog bands had influenced, or at least inspired, Sabbath to continue in that musical direction when writing material for Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Tony, at that time, said, "I think that with the passage of time, we've improved as musicians." The musical growth and experimentation aside, there was an extra musical aspect to these two albums, anger toward the management. 2 songs from Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and 2 songs from Sabotage deal with this theme. Geezer Butler said in a 1974 interview that Sabbath Bloody Sabbath showed their attitude towards the OL music business, the business side of it. "You can hear the frustration with management and lawyers on Sabotage," said Ozzy. In late April 1973, they returned to Los Angeles, to the same house actually, to write material for their 5th album. Tony said he had writer's block and only a couple of songs, based on live recordings. One of them would have been Killing Yourself to Live, but not much more than that, so they returned to the United Kingdom to try writing there instead. They rented Clearwell Castle, in southwestern England near the border of Wales, to continue working. On August 2nd, Tony said there was one more song to record and some of the lyrics and vocals yet to write, so the bulk of the writing and recording must have been done between May and July. According to Geezer in 1974, they spent 6 months working on the album. For Sabbath in 1973, that was a long time, and that it was the first album they had produced and mixed completely by themselves. The album opens with the title track named after the 1972 Bloody Sunday event in Northern Ireland, but it was actually about the management problems they had, their dislike of the press, the British press, in particular, and their attitude toward the music business. Tony offers a menacing riff to start the song. Bill Ward and Geezer soon join in, adding to the heaviness of the main riff. Bill does not play a typical rock beat but instead plays to the riff. Geezer milks the penultimate note of the riff by holding it out slightly longer than Tony and bending it, giving it his personal touch. Ozzy sings in his high register for the verse, always higher than the guitar, leaving plenty of sonic space. Some accuse Ozzy of following the guitar riff in his melodies, as if it is a bad thing to keep it simple and focused. This is an example of how Ozzy goes in contrary motion to the riff, enhancing the riff by giving it another dimension. Notice how, in the second half of the riff, Ozzy's melody descends, but the riff ascends. Have to Learn goes down as the 3 guitar chords go up. For the chorus, Ozzy comes down to his middle register, Tony plays acoustic guitars and electric guitar without distortion, and Bill plays lighter, giving the music a mellower vibe. Some of the types of chords Tony uses in this section are more common to jazz and folk pop, contrasting it with the heavy metal power chords used in the verse. Moreover, Ozzy's melody for On Your Own is jazz-like in how his notes relate to Tony's chords. In this section, Tony plays some nice guitar fills after the first 3 vocal phrases. After the 4th, where Ozzy sings the highest, the band comes in heavy again. The main riff returns, and a second guitar plays the melody of the riff higher, but still lower than where Ozzy sings.
In the second verse, the words, "Hands of Doom," recall the song, "Hand of Doom," from Paranoid but in a different context, or similar context, as, "Hands of Doom could take your mind away," could be interpreted as a drug reference. Geezer changes his bass line a bit at the end of the riff just after Ozzy sings, "Mind Away." He plays that same variation during Tony's solo. The band extends the second chorus, and as the music intensifies, Ozzy sings even higher for the words, "You bastards," leading it to the guitar solo. The solo is actually two guitars, one in each channel, playing almost exactly the same thing. The first phrase is played twice with the left guitar an octave lower. The third and fourth phrases are variations of the first, and the left guitar is now as high as the right guitar. The left guitar holds out the very last note throughout the whole phrase, but the right cuts out a half-second earlier. If it weren't for these small differences, it would sound like one guitar split into two channels. The band concludes this part of the song by going on to a bridge section and never bringing back material from the first 3 minutes. Notice in the second half of each time through the melody that Geezer and Tony play in harmony by not always playing the same notes as each other. Then, a long, held chord allows Bill the space to play a fill to take it to the next section. Notice the swing-like rhythms of his fill that foreshadow the outro of the song. At 3 minutos and 18 seconds you will hear one of Sabbath's heaviest riffs ever, heavy thanks to the palm muting of the strings, the thick distortion, and the very low register, so low in fact one must tune the guitar down 3 half steps in order to play it. As Geezer and Tony enter the abyss, Ozzy goes to the stratosphere by singing the highest notes of the song. These are no higher than the verse's high notes, but it seems like it because the guitars are so low and he slides up the note at the start of the At 3 minutes and 52 seconds, Tony plays a new riff, a sort of post-verse riff if you will, and Bill and Geezer stop momentarily to join back in for the big hits. The same held-out chord is played again for Bill to play another fill to take it back for another verse. After Ozzy's final verse, they repeat this post-verse section again, but on the held-out chord they change the groove or feel of the song. The feel, not unlike "Children of the Grave" from Master of Reality, was hinted at during Bill's fill in the song. Geezer joins in with the new groove, and then Tony for a new riff. Over this groove is a long pick slide on the guitar and overdubbed drum fills. As in "Children of the Grave" with the overdubbed timbre parts, we hear 2 bills. Once the groove is established, a second guitar solo begins but is quite short, and by 5 minutes and 28 seconds there are more pick slides and other noise from the guitar as the song fades out. The opening riff to "A National Acrobat" was written by Geezer, and as Tony explained, was probably the first one Geezer wrote that appeared in a Black Sabbath song, not considering the main riff to "Black Sabbath," whose lineage appears to be Gustav Holst to Geezer Butler to Tony Iommi. Geezer as author of the riff makes sense because it is a single-line riff requiring no chords, and bassists usually play one note at a time. Other single-line Sabbath riffs from this era include "Supernaut," "Electric Funeral," and "Black Sabbath." Listen for Geezer's inflection/ornamentation at about 2/3 the way through the riff. It's these little things, the bends, the hammer-ons, and the slides, that set Geezer apart from most bass players. Also, notice Tony's harmonized version of the riff melody played much higher. He used this same approach on "Supernaut" as well. Under Ozzy's vocals in the verse, Tony plays 4 heavy chords, the first of which is especially heavy due to the detuning of the guitar strings. In the second half of the verse, the chords are different and Ozzy harmonizes with himself in the left channel. The lyrics, as explained by Geezer, are about sperm that don't make it to the egg. At 2 minutes and 16 seconds, Tony introduces a new riff, never returning to the first one. This wah-drenched new riff uses the so-called Hendrix chord, supported by a funk drumbeat. Listen how Bill delays the snare drum a la the so-called James Brown beat. After 2 verses over the new riff, Tony plays a guitar duet, the one in the left channel focused on slow bends and long tones, and the one in the right channel busier. After the third verse from Ozzy, it is an instrumental until the end. At 4 minutes and 52 seconds, they go into a double-time feel and change to a major tonality, making the song sound as if it is opening up. After a riff change and key change, Geezer drops out to give it a stop-time feel as Bill and Tony continue. Notice here the bongos and cowbell in the right channel and the congas in the left. The added percussion and Bill's use of the bell of the ride cymbal give it a Latin rock flavor. Compare this to Santana, for example. The song ends with a final explosion from the full band, busy bass ascent, 2 guitars, left and right channels, ascending, and accented snare drum rolls, all culminating on the final climax of a single note. The next track on the album is an instrumental work titled Fluff, named after Alan "Fluff" Freeman, a BBC DJ who played their instrumental piece Laguna Sunrise for the opening of his show. It is not fluff, as in album filler, but a fine composition worth a closer listen. It begins with a lone guitar outlining just 2 chords, and a second guitar introduces the
Few German groups were as inventive as Florian Fricke's musical vehicle Popol Vuh, named after the holy book of the North American Maya Indians. Fricke was born on the 23rd of February 1944 in Lindau. During the 60s he studied grand piano and composition at the Freiburg University. After this, he worked sporadically as a music and film reviewer, and befriended someone who was to be a huge influence on his musical career, Eberhard Schoner, then the leader of the Munich Kammeroper. Schoner taught Fricke about the potential of a Moog synthesizer. In the spring of 1969 Fricke formed the first Popol Vuh crew of the Initiative of Liberty Records. The record label wanted Fricke to make an experimental Moog synthesizer album. It seemed likely that Liberty planned to cash in on something like the Walter Carlos album Switched on Bach, which had recently been a surprising commercial success for CBS. The resulting album, Affenstund, 1970, was really something totally different from this. A mystical journey through spooky tonal landscapes of gargling Moogs and ethnic percussion. This music attracted attention in the growing underground rock scene, and Popol Vuh recorded the 5 subsequent albums for Pils, Kosmisch Musik. In Den Garten Pharaohs, 1972, was the follow-up, development on their first album with the same musical ingredients. To create a more meditative effect Fricke also played organ and electric piano. The album contained just 2 extended tracks, in Den Garten Pharaohs, and Vuh. In 1972 Fricke also experienced a religious revival. When he converted to both Christianity and Hindu, he discounted electronics for a more acoustic style and reorganized Popol Vuh totally. This team made Hosianna Mantra, 1973, an album with titles like Kyrie, Segnung, and Andakt. The angelic soprano voice of Yoon matched the aesthetic and meditative music. The only similarity with the two previous albums was the slight ethnic touch. This album was the point of departure for Frick's further career. One of the most significant decisions in that career was when he participated on Connie Veit's second Gila album and as a consequence met Daniel Fischelsche, previously the drummer in Amon Duel 2. Frick and Fischelsche became the nucleus of Popol Vuh for future albums. The first of these, Selig Paisung, 1973, improved the meditative style of the previous album. Frick decided to sing the lyrics from Song of Solomon himself, adding an amateurish touch to the music, like Incredible String Band when their girlfriends were involved. It benefited from Fischelsche's twin instrumental talents, both as a guitarist and percussionist. Eliscu, Veit, and Wies also contributed to this album, recorded by Dirks in Stommelen and Baumberg. Agire, 1975, featured some of the music from Werner Herzog's film of the same name. Herzog and Frick were long-term friends from Frick's days as a film reviewer. This was a strange release, as it compiled recent alternative studio takes with the original music for the film. The long piece, Vergegenwartigung, was a solo Frick electronic number, a throwback to the first two Popol Vuh albums, probably recorded in late 1972. Also, Agire I was recorded before Frick discarded the Moogs and Mellotrons. This was a majestic and floating large-scale track. Morgengrass 2, Agnus Dei, and the guitar part of Agire 2 were probably recorded in May 1974 at the sessions for the forthcoming album Einsjäger und Siebenjäger and were fine examples of Fischelsche's brilliant guitar work. The album was originally only released in France and Italy. To add even more to the confusion, the German re-release on Pop Import 1982 had three later Popol Vuh tracks, Wo bist du, Der du überwundenest, and Auf dem Weg, from Die Nacht der Seele, Tantric Songs, 1979, and Die Umkehr, from Brüder des Schattens, Son des Lichts, 1978, replacing Vergegenwartigung. This is not mentioned on the cover nor the label. Either it was a mistake or an illegal replacement due to the loss of master tapes. Einsjäger und Siebenjäger, 1975, was recorded by Frick, Fischelsche and Yoon in Bavaria in May 1974. By this time Fischelsche also had begun to compose music. On this occasion, some of Popol Vuh's best music ever was recorded. A typical track of this period had a drum. Fischelsche had a particular passion for the use of cymbals and piano backing with two guitar overdubs playing the melody lines and Jong Yoon's magnificent voice added on the top. King Minos, Morgengrass, and Werfenspiel were good examples. Guts Land was a retitled version of Agnus Dei, already recorded twice on the two previous albums. Tile title track was a major work of 19 minutes, a recital of different musical themes. All lyrics were adapted from the Song of Solomon. Das Hohelied Salomos, 1975, included more of such adaptations. The music was as beautiful as before, now with added help from Ulgroma, sitar, and Shana Kumar, tablas. Ulgroma also contributed to the next 5 Popol Vuh albums. Let's Tage, Let's Nakti, 1976, was arguably their most pompous and grandiose album. The music was much more powerful and energetic than usual. Fischelsche's guitars built walk of sound backed by massive cymbals and drumming. Frick's piano almost drowned in this Amon Duel-like inferno of sound. Popol Vuh have been true pioneers of meditative music and world music, guided by the unique musical vision of Florian Frick. Every album is excellent in its own right, but for beginners I will particularly recommend Einsjäger und Siebenjäger and Das Hohelied Salomos.
Rush had spent the latter half of 1976 arriving as a bona fide concert act, having had their 2112 album effusively received by their cult following, and ridiculed loudly by detractors. That classic rite of passage, double live album, All the World's a Stage, arrived later in the year, with Rush looking to close one chapter and begin another. Recording in England for the first time, the band set up shop at the storied Rockfield Studios in rural Wales and set about building what would be their fussiest, most progressive set of songs, even if nods to other progressive rock tropes, such as the dominance of concept, would, in fact, mathematically fall short of 2112, which offered a whole side dedicated to one tale. Fortunately for the band's career arc, in among a farewell to King's swooping sense of time travel from past to far-flung future and all dream states in between, there would be a hit single in Closer to the Heart. At barely 3 minutes of buoyant and brisk balladry, and given its bells and seasonal timing, Closer to the Heart would give Canadians as well as the band's loyal Rust Belt American fans a carol for their Christmas of '77. As a result, November 16, 1977, A Farewell to Kings was certified the band's first U.S. gold record, with 2112 reaching the same gleaming plateau that same day. Indeed, it's difficult to gauge whether the usual pathway of a pop single was in fact the real reason Rush finally went gold. Fact is, this was the most consummate of album bands operating in an album-length milieu, that of progressive rock, even if Rush had been fortunate enough to also command the attention of almost any proud member of Aerosmith as Blue Army, or the Kiss Army, for that matter. In essence, the time was right for Rush, and it's a testimony to the pimply teens and the still stoners past 20 of the day that a record as challenging and, yes, considerably less proto-heavy metal than its predecessor could have been purchased and assimilated without any sense of outcry. It's also to the credit of the band that they propelled themselves forward. One senses with the knowledge that their bass could handle all these acoustic guitars, synthesizers, and percussion bells and whistles from their father's records, and reinterpretations of poetry from their English classes. As history would have it, Geddy, Alex, and Neil would immerse themselves in this flagrantly progressive Garden of Eden for but 2 records before reining it in. However, millions of Rush fans are glad they were taken on this trip, consistently citing A Farewell to Kings as one of the top handful of Rush albums of all time, arguably because of its daring to reach boldly for allegiance with the English art rock greats presumed untouchable by a next generation, much less by a trio of young and plucky suburban Canucks.